Blind Sight. The Truth Has a Sound. By Arthur Blackwood. Copyright 2026 Arthur Blackwood. All rights reserved. Prologue. The last sound Claire Novak ever heard was the soft click of a door closing behind her. She had been grading papers at her desk in the music department's faculty suite on the fourth floor of Hartwell Hall when she heard it, that small, precise sound, the kind a well-maintained door makes when someone who knows what they're doing pulls it shut with care. She did not look up immediately. She was in the middle of a comment about harmonic progression in the margin of a sophomore's composition exercise, and she believed in finishing her thoughts. When she did look up, the room appeared empty. The faculty suite was a long rectangular space with high ceilings and tall windows that looked out over the Charles River. At 7:15 on a Thursday evening in October, the river was black and still, catching the lights of the Cambridge skyline in long, trembling columns. The other faculty desks were unoccupied. The coat rack near the door held only her own things. The ceiling lights hummed at their familiar frequency, a G-flat, slightly flat, something that irritated Claire at the professional level of a musician's instinct since her first week at MIT 7 years ago. She set down her pen. The room smelled different. She noticed that the way musicians notice things, not as a conscious act of attention, but as a disturbance and expected, a wrong note in a familiar passage. Something clean and chemical underneath the usual smell of old paper and coffee, and particular dustiness of a room full of books that are consulted but not loved. Something that had not been there an hour ago. She pushed her chair back and started to stand. The cloth came over her face from behind with a speed and precision that allowed no reaction. Not violence, exactly, or not violence in the way she would have imagined it, frantic and loud. This was more like an event in physics, a fact asserting itself. The chemical smell was now the only smell in the world, and it moved through her in a warm, descending wave, and she had just enough consciousness remaining to think, with the clarity that sometimes arrives at the edge of unconsciousness, that the ceiling light was still humming its imprecise G-flat, and that it was the last sound she would hear, and that it seemed somehow wrong that it should be. She was wrong about that. The G-flat faded before she did. When it was over, her killer worked in silence that was not accidental. The building's HVAC system had been modified 3 days earlier, a small adjustment to the return air duct on the fourth floor that effectively isolated the faculty suite from the rest of the building's acoustic environment. The modification was elegant, technically precise, and completely reversible. It would be restored before anyone thought to check. The tuning fork was placed on Claire's sternum with the same care one might use to set a glass on a good table. It was a 256 Hz fork, middle C, the pitch from which all Western music is oriented, the frequency of clarity and beginning. It was still vibrating faintly when the door clicked shut again behind the person who had placed it there. The sound died after 3 seconds. After that, the room was perfectly, completely silent. The papers on Claire's desk fluttered once in the movement of displaced air and then settled. Her red pen had rolled to the edge of the desk and stopped there, balanced, as though making a decision. The river lights kept trembling in the black water below. The comment she had been writing in the margin of the sophomore's composition. The resolution feels forced. Let the tension breathe longer before you. Remained unfinished. She was found 11 hours later by the department administrator, who noticed the light still on in the faculty suite at 6:30 the following morning and went to turn it off. The administrator's name was Philip Garrett. He was 53 years old, methodical by nature, and had worked in the music department for 19 years without encountering anything he could not process with patience and procedure. He stood in the doorway of the faculty suite for a long time before he called anyone. Later he would say that what stopped him was not the sight of Claire Novak's body, though that was terrible enough. It was the silence. He had worked in a music building for 19 years. There was always sound. Practice rooms bleeding scales through walls, instruments being tuned, someone humming in a corridor. Even at 6:30 in the morning, the building had its own low, inhabited frequency. The faculty suite had none of that. It was a silence with quality to it, dense, deliberate, almost architectural. Philip Garrett was not a man given to metaphor, but standing in that doorway, He later told the detective assigned the case. It felt less like an absence of sound and more like someone had removed it on purpose, like someone had wanted very much to be heard. Chapter 1. The Professor. Daniel Morrow knew the lecture hall was full before he reached the door. He knew it the way he knew most things, through the accumulated evidence of sound, the particular resonance a room produces when it contains 200 bodies rather than an empty arrangement of seats, the low collective breath of an audience in the specific state between impatience and attention, the scrape of a chair being adjusted, the crinkle of a notebook being opened, the 17 distinct frequencies of mobile phones being silenced with varying degrees of urgency. He cataloged these sounds in the 3 seconds between opening the door and walking through it, the way other people might glance at a room and take in its dimensions. He did not need the dimensions. He had the acoustics. His cane found a slight elevation change at the threshold without him breaking stride. A 4-millimeter lip he had mapped on his first day in this building 11 years ago and never needed to think about again. The lecture hall at MIT's Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences was a semicircle of tiered seating that dropped toward a central lectern. He navigated the lectern with the unhurried precision of a man moving through a space he owned. He set his bag on the table beside the lectern, removed his jacket, folded it over the back of the chair with the automatic care of someone who has learned that the small orderings of objects are the difference between independence and its absence. Then he turned to face the room. Forensic sound analysis, he said, without preamble or greeting, is the practice of reconstructing events through acoustic evidence. Most of you enrolled in this course because you find that phrase interesting. Some of you are here because the prerequisite was easy. A small number of you, he paused, and the pause was precise, time to the length of a breath, are genuinely planning to use this in professional context. I teach to that group. If you're not in that group, I suggest you find a seat near the door. 2 students near the back left. He heard their footsteps, the particular acoustic signature of people leaving a room while trying not to be noticed, which is always more conspicuous than simply leaving. The remaining students did not move. Good. Daniel Morrow was 42 years old, lean in the way of men who forget to eat, with dark hair going gray at the temples and the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for calm. It was not calm. It was concentration, a permanent, low-level attention to the acoustic environment that never fully disengaged, not in sleep, not in conversation, not in the rare social situations his assistant Marcus Webb engineered on his behalf with the persistent optimism of someone who has not yet accepted the fundamental nature of the person he works for. He had been blind since birth. He did not think of this as a condition in any meaningful sense. It was simply the architecture of his existence, the way some people are left-handed or colorblind or constitutionally unable to maintain a comfortable ambient temperature. It had shaped him completely, and he had never wasted time imagining an alternative version of himself. That particular exercise in fiction struck him as both unproductive and faintly dishonest. What it had given him, what years of necessity had developed into something that colleagues at MIT occasionally described, with academic caution, as extraordinary, was a relationship with sound that went considerably beyond normal human perception. He heard things. He interpreted what he heard with the precision of a trained instrument and the intuition of someone who had spent 42 years building an internal map of the world from acoustic information alone. He had used this professionally for 16 years. The results: in 11 of the 14 cases in which law enforcement agencies had eventually and reluctantly requested his consultation, had been convictions. He was, by any metric that mattered to him, very good at his work. He was 40 minutes into the lecture, covering the acoustic properties of different building materials and their implications for sound reconstruction at crime scenes, when his phone vibrated in his jacket pocket. He ignored it. It vibrated again, then a third time, in the specific pattern he had assigned to Marcus for messages he had classified as requiring immediate attention. He did not break his sentence. He finished a point about the reflective properties of glass versus concrete, gave the class a reading assignment for Thursday, and ended the lecture 4 minutes early. The students filed out with the sound of people who have been given an unexpected gift and are slightly suspicious of it. He checked the message when the room was empty. 3 words from Marcus. "Police, your office." He stood for a moment in the empty lecture hall. Around him, the building settled into its post-class quiet. The particular acoustic texture of a space returning to itself after occupancy, like a room exhaling. Somewhere 2 floors above, a piano was being played with more determination than skill. A scale repeated, G major, ascending, always stopping on the 7th note before it turned to the root, as though the player could not quite commit to resolution. He picked up his bag and his cane and walked toward the elevator. He was not, he told himself, curious. He was simply going back to his office, where he had been planning to go anyway. The elevator announced its arrival with a tone at 440 hertz. Concert pitch. He had always found that either appropriate or ironic, depending on his mood. Today he found it ironic. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. His office occupied a corner of the 4th floor of Building 46, which gave it 2 exterior walls and a quality of ambient sound that Daniel considered one of the better acoustic environments on the MIT campus. The Charles River was audible on clear days, not its surface, which was silent, but particular way its presence modified the sound of wind moving across open water, a low, wide frequency that served as a kind of baseline against which other sounds registered more clearly. He heard the detective before he opened the door. A woman, mid to late 30s, he estimated, based on the quality of her voice as she spoke to Marcus in the anteroom outside his office. The specific register of authority that develops not with age but with sustained professional exposure to situations requiring it. She was not from Cambridge. Her vowels carried Boston South Shore, flattened and direct. She was standing, not sitting. Her shoes on the hardwood floor produced the sound of someone who had been standing for a while and had decided to remain standing rather than appear comfortable in an unfamiliar space. He opened the door. Professor Morrow. Not a question. She had been told what he looked like. Most people, meeting him for the first time, said his name as a question, as though confirming that the blind man was in fact the person they had come to see. This one did not. He adjusted his estimate of her slightly upward. Detective. He moved to his desk and sat. Did not gesture to the chair across from him. She would find it. Marcus closed the door. He heard Marcus withdraw with the particular reluctance of someone who wants very much to stay and listen, but has not been invited. The door closed. Detective Sarah Okafor, she said. Boston PD homicide. The sound of her sitting down, controlled, deliberate, the chair accepting her weight without the shift and settle of someone making themselves comfortable. She was not here to be comfortable. We have a situation at MIT. Music Department, Hartwell Hall. I know where Hartwell Hall is. A brief pause. She was recalibrating. Of course. A faculty member was found dead this morning. Claire Novak, associate professor of music theory. The preliminary assessment from our forensics team is that the cause of death is consistent with chemical asphyxiation, chloroform or a similar compound. And you're here because... Another pause, shorter this time. She had rehearsed this part and decided against the rehearsed version because of the way the scene was arranged. There are aspects of it that our forensics team can't account for. The building's acoustic system was modified. The HVAC return duct on the 4th floor was altered to isolate the faculty suite. Our tech guys say it was done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and there was an object left on the body. Daniel waited. A tuning fork, Detective Okafor said. Professional grade. 256 hertz, placed on the victim's chest. Her voice carried a particular flatness of someone delivering a fact they find disturbing, but have decided not to perform disturbance about. He respected that. Our department head suggested we contact you. I'll be honest with you, Professor Morrow, it wasn't my idea. It never is, he said. He was quiet for a moment. 256 hertz. Middle C. The frequency from which all Western musical tuning derives its reference point. Not random, not decorative. A statement. When can I see the scene? It's still active. We can go now if you're available. I'm available. He stood and reached for his jacket. I'll need unrestricted access to the space. No one speaking unless I ask a direct question. No one moving unless I tell them to. Your forensics team stays out of the room while I'm in it. The quality of her silence told him she was deciding how much of this to accept. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had spent 42 years in a world that moved at the speed of other people's comfort, and he had learned that patience was not a virtue but a tactical advantage. "Fine," she said finally. "Good." He picked up his cane. "Send someone to tell my assistant I won't be back today. He'll worry otherwise. It's unnecessary, but I found it's less disruptive to manage it than to ignore it." He heard her stand, heard the small, involuntary intake of breath that people produce when they are reassessing a situation they thought they understood. He had heard that sound many times. He never grew entirely indifferent to it. "After you," he said, and moved to the door. Chapter 2. Middle C. Hartwell Hall smelled of old mahogany, rosin, and particular kind of institutional quiet that buildings acquire when they have been dedicated to a single purpose for a long time. Daniel stood in the main entrance for 30 seconds before moving. Detective Okafor had learned quickly. She had said nothing since they entered the building, and she had communicated the same requirement to the uniformed officer at the door with an efficiency that suggested she was someone accustomed to translating unusual instructions into operational reality without editorial comment. He noted this as useful. He listened to the building. A building, to Daniel, was a collection of acoustic events organized in space. The materials of construction, stone, glass, wood, concrete, each produced and modified sound differently. The age of the building altered these properties. Older plaster absorbed sound at different rates than modern drywall. Old hardwood floors transmitted vibration in ways that synthetic surfaces could not replicate. He had spent years developing what he privately called acoustic cartography, the practice of building a precise three-dimensional map of a space through sound, the way a bat navigates in darkness, though he found a bat comparison reductive and mentioned it to no one. Hartwell Hall was a 1924 building, brick and limestone exterior, hardwood floors throughout, with a particular interior acoustic signature of a space designed to contain and direct music, vaulted ceilings in the main corridors, practice rooms lining the east and west wings with heavy soundproof doors, stairwells that carried sound in concentrated columns between floors. He built its outline in his mind as he stood there, cross-referencing what he heard against what he expected, noting the variations. There was one variation that should not have been there. "The fourth floor," he said. "Yes," Okafor said. "The acoustic signature is wrong. This building should have a continuous resonant frequency through its vertical structure, the stairwells acting as transmission columns. The fourth floor is dampened, not naturally dampened, deliberately." He turned toward the stairwell. "The HVAC modification you mentioned. Where exactly?" "Return air duct at the north end of the fourth floor corridor. Our tech team says a baffle was inserted. A piece of acoustic foam fitted to the interior of the duct. Reduced the airflow noise by about 60%. Not the airflow noise," Daniel said, already moving toward the stairs. "The acoustic bridge. The duct system in a building like this acts as a transmission pathway for sound between floors and between rooms. Modify it correctly, and you can effectively isolate a single space from the building's overall acoustic environment. Someone who understood that used the HVAC system to create a dead zone on the fourth floor, specifically around the faculty suite." He paused on the first step. This person understood architectural acoustics at a professional level. Okafor was quiet for a moment. "Then, we're working on that." He climbed. The stairwell produced exactly the sound he expected, which told him nothing new about the building, and confirmed that its acoustic properties had not been altered below the fourth floor. Selective intervention. Specific intent. He filed this carefully. The fourth floor corridor greeted him with a silence that was immediately physically different from the floors below. Not the absence of sound. There was sound. The muffled conversation of two forensics technicians waiting in the corridor, the distant wail of the siren from outside the building, the particular hiss of the modified HVAC system working against its own alteration. But the connecting frequencies that should have threaded all of these sounds into a continuous acoustic environment were absent. The sounds existed as isolated events, unrelated, like words in a sentence with all the syntax removed. It was deeply, instinctively wrong in a way that Daniel suspected only he in this building was equipped to feel. "The room," he said. Okafor spoke briefly to the forensics technicians. He heard them move away down the corridor with a particular acoustic signature of professionals who disagree with instruction but have been given it by someone with authority over their immediate future. The faculty suite door opened. Okafor held it. He entered and stopped 3 steps inside. The room was a specific kind of silence. He had encountered it before, twice in his career, in spaces where the acoustic environment had been deliberately manipulated, a recorded silence, almost a silence that felt constructed rather than natural. The kind of silence that exists not because there is nothing to hear, but because something has removed the possibility of being heard. He stood very still and let the room come to him. The windows were closed. He could tell without touching them from the way the room's internal frequency reflected off glass rather than open air, a cleaner return, more immediate. The ceiling height was approximately 4 meters, consistent with what he had mapped downstairs. The room was perhaps 12 meters by 8. There were multiple desks. He counted 6 distinct areas of acoustic absorption that desks and their associated objects produce, the irregular surfaces of piled books and paper swallowing specific frequency ranges in ways that a clear surface does not. The body was at the desk second from the left along the window wall. He did not need to be told this. The room's acoustic map told him there was something at that desk that was different from the other 5, a density, a mass, an object that absorbs sound in the specific way that a human body does, differently from furniture or stacked materials. Living bodies produce their own sound. Dead bodies do not, but they absorb sound in a way that is distinctive if you know what to listen for. He moved toward the desk. His cane found the leg of the chair, and he adjusted, moving around it. He crouched beside the desk. He did not touch the body. He had learned, early in his consultancy work, that the boundary between what he was permitted to do and what others found acceptable was one he had to manage carefully. Instead, he held his hand approximately 30 centimeters above the area where the tuning fork had been placed and remained still. He could not hear the tuning fork. It had long since stopped vibrating, but its presence was detectable in a way that solid metal objects produce a specific pattern of sound reflection. The return from the fork's tines was fractionally different from the return from the desk surface, a small asymmetry in the way sound bounced back that his auditory cortex processed without his having to consciously direct it. 256 hertz, he said, to no one in particular. Middle C, the pitch from which Western musical tuning is calibrated. He was quiet for a moment. Why middle C? We assumed it was connected to the victim's field. Okafor said from near the door. She was a music theorist. Possible, Daniel said. But music theorists don't think in individual pitches. They think in relationships between pitches. Middle C by itself isn't a music theory statement. It's a calibration statement, a starting point. He paused, and something moved in him that was not quite professional instinct and not quite something else, a first word. He stood and turned slowly, facing the center of the room. The HVAC modification, the acoustic isolation, the specific choice of frequency. This was not a crime committed in silence because the killer feared noise. This was a crime committed in silence because the killer understood silence, understood it the way Daniel understood it, as a language, as a medium, as the space in which the meaning of sound becomes visible. Detective Okafor. Yes, this is not your only victim. A silence, the kind that humans produce when they're deciding whether to be honest. We're not prepared to characterize it as. Detective. Another pause. Then, there was an incident 6 weeks ago. A man found in a parking structure in the South End. Acoustic evidence at the scene was, she chose the next word carefully, unusual. We didn't connect it at the time. The tuning fork was a different frequency. Daniel absorbed this without moving. What frequency? 384 hertz. He was very still. 384 hertz. Middle G, the fifth above middle C. C and G, the first 2 notes of the most fundamental interval in Western music, the perfect fifth, the interval from which all harmonic systems derive their logic, the relationship that the ear recognizes before any other as consonant, as resolve, as the beginning of order, a starting point. And then a second note. He turned toward the window. Outside, Cambridge continued this afternoon indifferently. unaware that in a silent room on the fourth floor of a music building, something had just arranged itself into the beginning of a pattern. "Who else knows about the connection between the two cases?" he asked. At this point, my captain, 2 detectives in my unit, the forensics leads on both scenes. "Keep it that way." He turned back toward the room. "I need the complete file on the South End case. Every acoustic detail, your team documented. Every photograph, the precise specifications of the tuning fork." He paused. "And I need to know who in Boston has the technical knowledge to modify a building's HVAC system for acoustic isolation purposes. That list will be short." "How short?" "Very," he said. "Whoever did this doesn't just understand acoustics. They think in acoustics. They experience the world through sound the way I do." He moved toward the door, his cane finding the clear path through furniture with the unhurried efficiency of long practice. "Which means they know who I am." He said this without drama. It was simply, he believed, a logical conclusion. He did not examine, in that moment, what it felt like to arrive at it. He would examine it later, alone, in the specific way he examined things that disturbed him, methodically, without sentiment, until the feeling had been disaggregated into its component parts, and each part had been assigned its appropriate weight. For now there was work to do. He walked out of the faculty suite and into the corridor and did not look back at the room, because looking back was not something he did, in any sense of the phrase, and had not been for a very long time. Chapter 3. The First Frequency. The South End case file arrived at Daniel's office at 8:47 the following morning, delivered by a junior detective named Reyes, who knocked twice, announced himself, left the file on the desk Marcus indicated, and departed without speaking to Daniel directly. He noted this and found it, on balance, preferable to the alternative. Marcus read in the file. This was their established process for documents. Marcus read. Daniel listened, occasionally interrupting to ask for a specific detail to be repeated or a particular section to be reread in full. It was faster than Braille transcription for standard case documents, and Daniel had found over years of collaboration that Marcus's reading voice carried additional information. The small hesitations, the slight changes in cadence that occurred when a reader encountered something unexpected or disturbing. These he noted as data points alongside the content itself. Marcus hesitated twice in the first 3 pages. The victim's name was Robert Adler, 51 years old, an architect, sole proprietor of a small firm specializing in acoustic design, concert halls, recording studios, private listening rooms for clients who could afford the precise calibration of their domestic sonic environment. He had been found in the parking structure adjacent to his office building in the South End on a Wednesday evening in early September, cause of death consistent with the same chemical asphyxiation profile as Claire Novak. No witnesses. No useful security footage. The parking structure's camera on level 3 had developed a fault 3 days earlier and had not yet been repaired. The tuning fork had been placed on his chest. 384 hertz. Professional grade. Same manufacturer as the fork found with Claire Novak, though the forensics team had not made this connection at the time, because the South End case had initially been classified as a possible drug-related incident before the toxicology results clarified the chemical cause of death. "Stop," Daniel said. Marcus stopped. "The acoustic evidence section. Read it again from the beginning." Marcus found a page and read. The forensics team had noted, in the parking structure, an unusual absence of ambient sound in the area where Adler's body was found. The structure was a standard poured concrete design, a type of building that typically produces significant reverberation and echo, sound bouncing between flat parallel surfaces with the undisciplined persistence of concrete's particular acoustic signature. Level 3, where the body was found, showed instead a marked absorption of ambient sound in a radius of approximately 4 meters around the body's location. The forensics report described this as acoustically anomalous and attributed it to possible construction materials in that section of the structure before moving on to other evidence. Daniel sat with this for a moment. "They didn't understand what they were looking at," he said. "I mean, to be fair, most people wouldn't." Marcus began. "The absorption wasn't structural. It was applied. Acoustic absorption panels, or their equivalent, placed temporarily around the site and removed before discovery. The killer created a localized dead zone in the parking structure the same way they created one in Hartwell Hall, not through the building's infrastructure in this case, but through portable materials. Daniel stood and moved to the window. The Charles River was audible today, a cold October wind moving across open water, the particular low-frequency wash of it carrying through the glass in a way that he found, if he was honest, the closest thing to comfort that geography offered him. This person carries the silence with them. Marcus was quiet. This was the other quality Daniel valued in him. He knew when silence was a correct response. Robert Adler, acoustic architect. Daniel turned from the window. Claire Novak, music theorist. Both connected to sound professionally. Both killed with the same method. Both left with a tuning fork. Different frequencies. He moved back to his desk. The interval between 256 and 384 Hz is a perfect fifth, C to G. In acoustic terms, the most consonant interval in the harmonic series. The first overtone relationship that the human auditory system recognizes as resolved. In musical terms, it's a foundation of every harmonic system Western music has developed for the past 1,000 years. He's Saturday, this is a sequence. These are not two murders. This is a composition. A composition, Marcus repeated, in the tone of someone confirming they've heard correctly a sentence they find alarming. An organized sequence of frequencies with internal harmonic logic. Someone is building something. 2 notes so far. A perfect fifth C and G. He was quiet. The next note in the most common continuation of that interval would complete a major triad. E, 320 Hz. Which means there will be another victim, Daniel said, unless we find this person first. He picked up his phone. Get Detective Okafor on the phone. And find me the complete list of MIT and Boston University faculty with expertise in architectural acoustics or acoustic engineering. Cross-reference with anyone who has published research in forensic sound analysis. You think the killer is academic? I think the killer has the technical knowledge of someone who has spent years in a professional acoustic environment. That knowledge is acquired formally or through sustained professional practice. Academia is the most concentrated source of it. He paused. Also, he said, with the particular care of someone choosing words not for precision, but for something else, something he was not entirely prepared to examine directly. The forensic sound analysis literature is a small field. Most of the significant work in it has come out of this department. If someone wanted to find the people in Boston who think the way this killer thinks, they would find them here. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Daniel, are you saying? I'm saying get me Okafor, Daniel said. Put everything else aside. Marcus left the room. Daniel sat in particular quiet of his office and listened to the building around him. Its familiar frequencies, its reliable acoustic geometry, the way it had sounded for 11 years of daily occupation. He was good at detecting alterations in acoustic environments. He had built his entire professional life on that ability. He wondered, for the first time, whether someone had spent time studying that, whether someone had decided to use it. His phone rang. Okafor's number. He answered on the first ring. There's going to be a third victim, he said, before she could speak. I need everything your department has on Robert Adler's professional network. Everyone he worked with, everyone who studied with him, everyone who competed with him for contracts. And I need it today. There was a pause on her end. Then, good morning to you too, Professor. He almost said something that, for him, approximated a courtesy. He stopped himself. It would set an inaccurate precedent. The files, he said. I'll have them to you by noon. Her voice carried the sound of someone standing up, already moving. He found he had developed, in less than 24 hours, a reasonable acoustic vocabulary for Detective Sarah Okafor. She was efficient. She was direct. She did not waste motion or words. He could work with that. One more thing, he said. Yes. The third victim will be connected to sound professionally. Same profile as Novak and Adler. And the tuning fork will be 320 Hz. He paused. Make a note of that. If there's any report in the next weeks of an unexplained death involving someone with professional connection to acoustics, music, or audio engineering, any unusual acoustic circumstances at the scene, I want to know within the hour. A silence on her end. Not a processing silence. She was fast. This was something else. You're certain? About the frequency, yes. About the victim profile. Highly probable. About the timeline, he paused. That I don't know. It could be tomorrow. It could be 3 weeks from now. This person is not impulsive. They plan with precision. But the sequence won't stop at 2 notes. Because a 2-note sequence isn't a composition. He was briefly surprised. Then he was not. Exactly. I'll call you at noon, she said, and ended the call. Daniel set down the phone and sat for a moment in the silence of his office. Outside, the wind had shifted, and the sound of the river was gone, replaced by the more contained acoustic environment of the campus. Footsteps on brick, distant voices. The particular harmonic resonance of a place where many people are concentrated in purposeful activity. Somewhere in the city, he thought, there was a third person who worked with sound, who had built their professional life around the physics of it, the way it moved through air and structure and the architecture of human spaces. Somewhere in the city, someone was thinking about them, and somewhere in the city, he allowed himself to think it quietly once, before storing in the place where he put things that were not yet useful. Someone was thinking about him. He opened his laptop. He had 3 hours before noon. He began to work. Chapter 4. The Architect's Network. The files Okafor sent at noon were thorough. Daniel had not expected otherwise. She struck him as someone who did not do things partially. Robert Adler's professional network was a map of a man who had spent 30 years building something careful and specific. His firm, Adler Acoustic Design, had completed 47 projects in the Boston metropolitan area over the course of its existence. Concert halls, recording studios, 2 university lecture theaters, a handful of high-end residential commissions for clients whose names appeared in the financial pages of the Globe with the regularity of recurring weather patterns. His client list was a portrait of institutional Boston. The Symphony, 2 private schools, a biotech campus in Kendall Square that had wanted a conference center calibrated to the specific frequency range most conducive to focus group cognition. This last commission Daniel found interesting. It suggested a client base that thought about sound the way he did, not as atmosphere but as architecture. He had Marcus Redham Adler's published work next. There were 6 papers, 3 in academic journals and 3 in professional trade publications, spanning a period from 2009 to 2021. The academic papers were dense and technical, material absorption coefficients, standing wave prediction models, the acoustic implications of irregular ceiling geometry. The trade publications were more accessible but no less precise. Daniel listened to all 6 with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered, interrupting only twice to ask for specific passages to be repeated. The second interruption came during the 3rd academic paper, published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 2014. Read that section again, he said, from the Application of Forensic Acoustic Principles. Marcus found it and read. Adler had written, in the paper's concluding section, about the potential application of architectural acoustic analysis to crime scene investigation. Specifically, the possibility of reconstructing the acoustic history of a space to determine what sounds had occurred there, when, and under what physical conditions. The section was 4 paragraphs long and cited, in its footnotes, 2 prior papers on the subject. One of the citations was Daniel's own doctoral dissertation. The other was a paper published in 2011 by a researcher at Boston University's Department of Physics, a Dr. Owen Farrell. Forensic Applications of Architectural Acoustics, a Theoretical Framework. Stop, Daniel said. Marcus stopped. Daniel sat very still. The name meant something, not from a personal encounter. He was certain they had never met, from a paper, from a conference, possibly, heard rather than attended in person, from the particular peripheral awareness he maintained of his own field, the way any specialist tracks the work happening in adjacent territories. Owen Farrell, Boston University, Acoustic Physics. 2011. He had the memory now. A paper that had circulated in the forensic acoustics community, with some controversy. A theoretical framework for using acoustic analysis in criminal investigation that was, in Daniel's assessment at the time, ambitious to the point of overreach. The methodology had gaps. The conclusions went beyond what the evidence could support. He had noted it, filed it as the work of someone with genuine technical ability, but insufficient discipline, and moved on. He had never written a response to it. He had never needed to. The paper had not been widely cited outside a small specialist community. Within 2 years, it had effectively disappeared from active academic conversation. Marcus. Yes. Find everything available on Owen Farrell. Boston University, Physics Department. Specialization in acoustic engineering. Publication history. Current employment status. Any professional or academic disputes on record. And find out whether he's still in Boston. Marcus left without asking why. This was another quality Daniel valued in him. He sat alone in his office and thought about a paper he had read 13 years ago and dismissed in 2 pages of private notes that he had never shared with anyone. He thought about the specific quality of intellectual dismissal, how it felt from the inside, from the position of the person doing the dismissing, a small, clean act of professional judgment. And he tried, with the deliberateness of a man who does not often try to imagine other people's inner states, to consider how it might feel from the other side. He did not reach a conclusion. He rarely did with questions of that kind. He picked up his phone and called Okafor. "I have a name for you to run," he said when she answered. Owen Farrell, former Boston University faculty, acoustic physics. Find out where he is and what he's been doing for the past 5 years. You want to tell me why? He published work in forensic acoustic analysis. In 2011, Robert Adler cited it. It connects all 3 of us, Adler, Farrell, and me, in the same professional literature. He paused. The killer's technical knowledge is consistent with someone who has worked in this field at a serious level. Farrell's work suggests he has that knowledge. A pause on her end. That's a thin thread. "Yes," he said. "Run it anyway." She said she would. He ended the call and returned to files. He worked through the afternoon with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who has learned that sustained attention produces better results than urgency. He mapped Adler's network against Claire Novak's, looking for intersections beyond the obvious professional proximity of 2 people who work with sound in the same city. There were 3, a shared client, a private concert hall in Beacon Hill that Adler had designed and Novak had consulted on the acoustic calibration for, a conference 6 years ago where both had presented papers, and a joint grant application to the National Endowment for the Arts, submitted 4 years ago and ultimately unsuccessful, for a project investigating the acoustic preservation of historic Boston performance spaces. The grant application listed 4 collaborators: Adler, Novak, a sound engineer from the Boston Symphony Orchestra named Patricia Lim, and a consultant listed only as F. Owen, whose institutional affiliation was given as independent. Daniel read the name again in his mind in the silence of his office. F. Owen. He reached for his phone. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Marcus returned at 4:15 with the information on Owen Farrell, delivered with the particular verbal efficiency he adopted when he understood that what he was reporting was significant. Owen Farrell had been an associate professor of acoustic physics at Boston University from 2008 to 2016. His research had focused on the intersection of architectural acoustics and information theory. Specifically, what acoustic environments could reveal about the events that had occurred within them. He had published 11 papers, the 2011 Forensic Acoustics paper among them. His teaching evaluations had been consistently strong. His departmental record showed no formal complaints or disputes. In 2016, he had taken a medical leave of absence. He had not returned. The medical leave, Daniel said, "What for?" The university records don't specify. Medical privacy. But I found a profile piece in the BU Alumni magazine from 2017. Marcus paused. It mentions that he had been dealing with progressive sensory neural hearing loss. The piece says he'd been diagnosed in 2014. Daniel absorbed this without expression. Does it say the current status? The piece says as of 2017, he had lost approximately 80% of his hearing in both ears. It describes him as, Marcus found the line, adapting to a new relationship with the field he has devoted his career to. The room was very quiet. Daniel sat with the information the way he sat with acoustic data, letting it settle into the space it occupied, finding its shape. A man who had built a professional life around sound, who had developed, at the height of his career, the theoretical framework for using acoustic analysis to investigate crime, who had then, by incremental and irreversible degrees, lost the ability to hear. Daniel knew, at a level that was not analytical but something older and more physical, what that loss would mean, not as tragedy. He had no frame of reference for losing something he had never had, but as a specific, particular destruction of the primary instrument through which a person understood the world, the equivalent for him of losing not sight. He had never had sight, but hearing itself, the thing that was not a sense but a language. He did not allow himself to stay with this thought longer than was useful. Current address? Nothing current. He left Boston after the leave of absence. There's a forwarding address from 2017, a P.O. box in Somerville, but it's almost certainly inactive. Marcus hesitated. Daniel, is this our guy? I don't know yet, Daniel said, which was true. What he had was a thread. Thin but real, the kind of thread that either led somewhere or did not, and the only way to know was to follow it. Call Okafor. Tell her what you found. Ask her to run Farrell through the full system, DMV, tax records, any current address. He stood and moved to the window. The afternoon light was shifting. He could tell from the way the ambient sound of the campus changed as the day moved toward evening, the particular acoustic texture of a place emptying, students dispersing, the energy of the place redistributing itself. Somewhere in this city, he thought, there was a man who had lost his hearing and kept working, who had taken a theoretical framework he'd built for understanding crime through sound and turned it, by some process Daniel could not yet fully trace, into something else entirely. Or perhaps not. Perhaps Owen Farrell was simply a man who had suffered professional catastrophe and retreated, and the threads connecting him to this case were coincidence and proximity and the smallness of a specialist field. Daniel did not believe in coincidence as an analytical category, but he believed in the danger confirmation of finding the pattern you're looking for, because you are looking for it. He would wait for Okafor's information. He would build the case from evidence, not intuition. He returned to his desk and continued working. Chapter 5. What Sound Remembers. The anechoic chamber in the basement of Building 36 was the quietest place Daniel had ever been. He went there sometimes, when he needed to think without the interference of the acoustic environment, when the continuous information stream of sound that constituted his experience of the world became too dense to process efficiently. The chamber was a room within a room, a concrete shell suspended on isolation mounts inside the outer building structure, its interior surfaces covered floor to ceiling with fiberglass wedges that absorb sound rather than reflecting it, reducing the ambient noise level to -9 decibels, below the threshold of human hearing. The silence inside was not the silence of an empty room or a quiet night. It was a technical silence, an engineered absence, and in it Daniel could hear his own heartbeat, his own breathing, the very faint sound of blood moving to the vessels behind his ears. Most people found it unbearable after 20 minutes. Daniel had once spent 3 hours in it without discomfort. He went there the evening after Marcus reported on Owen Farrell, after Okafor called to say the address search had returned nothing current, and she was escalating to a formal missing persons cross-reference, after the day's information had accumulated to the point where processing it required the removal of all interference. He sat on the chamber's single chair, a plain wooden one, chosen because it was acoustically neutral at the frequencies that mattered, and he thought. 2 victims, 2 frequencies, a perfect fifth, a man who had built a theoretical framework for forensic acoustics and then lost his hearing, a killer who operated in constructed silence and communicated in musical intervals. These things might connect. They might not. What he knew with certainty was the internal logic of what had been done so far. Someone with deep technical knowledge of acoustic architecture. Someone who understood silence as a tool rather than absence. Someone who left frequencies as signatures. These were not the actions of a person who thought about sound casually. These were the actions of a person for whom sound was the primary organizing principle of experience, which brought him, in the silence of the chamber, to the question he had been circling since the moment he stood in the faculty suite at Hartwell Hall and understood that the killer's technical vocabulary was not merely professional, but personal. Who in Boston? Who in this specific field, this small and particular community of people who thought about sound forensically, had reason to do this? And why these victims? Why Adler? Why Novak? Two people connected to sound professionally, yes, but connected to it in different ways. An architect who shaped acoustic space, a theorist who analyzed musical structure. What was the principle of selection? The grant application suggested a link, but the grant had included two other collaborators whose names he had not yet fully investigated. Patricia Lim, the Boston Symphony sound engineer. He made a note in the internal filing system he had developed over a lifetime of processing the world without writing things down, to have Marcus contact the symphony in the morning. He sat in the silence for another 30 minutes, letting the thoughts move through their own logic without forcing them toward conclusions. This was the part of his process that he had never been able to explain adequately to the detectives and prosecutors who worked with him. The necessity of not thinking, in the conventional directed sense, about a problem, of allowing the information to arrange itself according to its own internal structure rather than imposing a structure on it from outside. Sound, he had always believed, told the truth if you gave it space to do so. But the mistake most investigators made, the mistake most people made with most things, was filling the space with noise before the signal had time to emerge. In the anechoic chamber, there was no noise, only signal. What the silence told him, after 30 minutes, was this: the killer was not communicating with the police. The acoustic modifications, the specific frequencies, the technical precision of the staging, none of this was designed to be understood by a standard homicide investigation. Standard homicide investigations did not have the vocabulary for it. The message, if it was a message, and he was increasingly certain it was addressed to someone specific, someone who would understand the frequencies as a sequence, someone who would hear the construction of silence as a technical statement, someone like him. He sat with his conclusion in the engineered quiet of the chamber and allowed himself, for the first time, to feel the particular quality of being directly addressed by something that had killed two people in order to speak. It was not fear, exactly. He had a complex relationship with fear. The emotion existed in him. He was aware of its functional presence, but it manifested differently than it appeared to in others, less as a physical state than as a sharpening of attention, a heightening of the signal-to-noise ratio, a clarification. He was very clear, sitting in the silence. He stood and found his cane and walked to the chamber door. The moment he opened it, the world returned. The ambient hum of the building systems, the distant sound of a car on Massachusetts Avenue, the characteristic creak of Building 30 at its aging stairwell. A cascade of information, familiar and immediate. He stood in the doorway between the two acoustic environments for a moment. Then he went upstairs to call Okafor. She answered on the second ring. It was past 9 in the evening, and she sounded precisely as alert as she had at noon, which told him something about her working patterns that he filed for future reference. I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as an analytical conclusion, not as speculation, he said. A brief pause. Okay. The killer is communicating with me. Specifically, the acoustic staging, the frequency choices, the technical precision. It's not random, and it's not directed at your department. It's directed at someone with my specific knowledge base. Someone who would understand the frequencies as a sequence, the silence as a technical statement, the tuning forks as a vocabulary. He paused. I don't know yet what they're saying, but I know who they're saying it to. Silence on her end. Longer than usual. You're telling me the killer knows you're on the case. I'm telling you the killer designed the case to bring me onto it. The staging at Hartwell Hall was specific enough that any competent investigator would eventually consult someone with my background. The killer anticipated that, may have counted on it. Another silence. He could hear her breathing, steady, controlled, a person managing a significant piece of information without allowing it to become a reaction. If that's true, she said finally, then you're not just a consultant on this case. No, he agreed. You're part of it. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had the particular quality of someone making a decision. There are protocols for this. If you're a potential target, I'm not removing myself from the investigation, he said. His voice was level. It was always level. People occasionally mistook this for emotional absence. It was not. It was the product of a long practice of keeping the instrument calibrated. If the killer is communicating with me, then my continued involvement is the only way to receive the communication. Removing me from the case doesn't protect me. It silences the only channel we have. A long pause. He waited. This is going to be a difficult conversation with my captain, she said. I imagine so. Do you have any sense of what the message is? What they're trying to say? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. C and G, a perfect fifth, the harmonic interval that Western music returns to instinctively as a point of resolution, of arrival, of coming home. And yet in harmonic context, a perfect fifth is not a resolution. It is a statement of direction. It points toward something. It creates expectation. The sequence is incomplete, he said. 2 notes of what will be more. What I know is that the interval chosen so far, the perfect fifth, is the most fundamental constant relationship in acoustic physics. It's the interval that signals the beginning of order, the establishment of a key, the announcement that something is starting. He paused. Whoever this is, they're not finishing. They're beginning. The line was quiet for a moment. I'll talk to my captain in the morning. Okafor said, don't go anywhere alone tonight. I live alone. I know. I'm putting a car outside your building. He started to object. He stopped himself. It was, he recognized, a reasonable precaution, and he had a tendency. One Marcus had pointed out with the patient persistence of someone who has identified a genuine flaw in an otherwise functional person, to resist reasonable precautions on principle rather than on merit. All right, he said. He could hear the faint surprise in her silence. Good. It was useful to be occasionally unpredictable. Good night, Professor Morrow. Good night, Detective. He ended the call and stood for a moment in the corridor of Building 46. Around him, the night version of the building had settled in, the heating system cycling through its lower nocturnal frequency, the last of the graduate students moving through distant offices toward the exits, the particular muffled quality of a large institutional space occupied by only a fraction of its daytime population. He gathered his things and walked to the elevator. Outside, the city would be doing what cities do at night. Not sleeping, but shifting register, dropping into a different key. He would walk home. He did this every night regardless of weather. A 20-minute route he had mapped so thoroughly that he could have navigated it with his acoustic perception deliberately suppressed. Tonight, he would not suppress it. Tonight, he would listen to everything. Chapter 6. 320 Hertz. Patricia Lim had been the principal sound engineer for the Boston Symphony Orchestra for 11 years. She was, by every account Marcus assembled, exceptionally good at her job. The kind of person whose professional excellence is so complete that it becomes unremarkable, the baseline against which all other work in the same sphere is measured without the measuring being noticed. She was also, Daniel learned on the morning of the 3rd day, already aware that her former colleagues were dead. He met her at Symphony Hall at 9 in the morning, in the engineer's booth at the rear of the main auditorium, a glass-fronted room elevated above the orchestra level, accessible through a narrow corridor and a door that required a key card. Okafor was with him. She had insisted, and he had not objected, partly because the previous night's conversation had recalibrated something in professional understanding between them, and partly because he recognized the value of having someone in the room who could see. Patricia Lim's voice was precise and carefully controlled, in the way of someone who has spent years working in an environment where imprecise communication has immediate and audible consequences. She was, he estimated, somewhere in her mid-40s. She had learned of Novak's death from a colleague at MIT and of Adler's from a news alert she had set up years ago for his firm, on the basis that his projects occasionally affected the acoustics of venues she worked with. I didn't connect them immediately, she said. Robert died in September. I was grieved, but I didn't. The circumstances weren't public. When Claire died, I started thinking. The grant application, Daniel said. A short silence. You know about that. The 4 collaborators. You, Adler, Novak, and consultant listed as F. Owen. He paused. Tell me about F. Owen. The quality of her silence changed. It became the silence of someone managing something. Not deception, he judged, but something more complicated. History, perhaps. The particular weight of a professional relationship that had ended badly. His name is Francis Owen Farrell, she said. We knew him as Owen. He was at BU when we worked on the grant application. Acoustic physics. He was brilliant, actually. The kind of brilliant that's difficult to work with because they know it. What happened with the grant? We didn't get it. The panel's feedback was that the theoretical framework was, they said, overreaching. Owen's section. She paused. He took it badly. He believed the framework was sound, that the panel hadn't understood it. He was, she chose the next word carefully, intense about it. He'd staked a great deal on that application. What happened after? We drifted apart professionally. And then I heard he'd taken medical leave from BU. Hearing loss. Her voice carried something that was not quite guilt and not quite grief, but occupied the territory between them. I should have reached out. I didn't. Ms. Lim, Okafor said, her first contribution to the conversation, and Daniel noted the timing. She had waited until the emotional register of the exchange created an opening for a direct question. Do you have any current contact information for Owen Farrell? No. I haven't heard from him in a pause. 6 years. Maybe 7. Did he ever express any hostility toward you, or toward your other collaborators on the grant? Another silence. Longer. There was an email. She said finally, after the rejection. He sent it to all 3 of us, me, Robert, Claire. He said the panel had been advised against the application. That someone had, she was choosing her words very carefully now, preemptively undermined the framework. Did he name who? Daniel asked, though he already knew the shape of what was coming. Yes, she said. He named you, Professor Morrow. He said you had communicated privately with the grant panel, that you had characterized this theoretical framework as a breath insufficiently rigorous. The engineer's booth was very quiet. Through the glass, the main auditorium of Symphony Hall spread in the particular acoustic grandeur of a space designed to make music feel inevitable. The empty seats arranged in their curved rows like a waiting audience for a performance that had not yet been scheduled. Did I? Daniel said. I don't know. I never asked you. I assumed, she stopped. I assumed he was wrong, that it was grief talking. The grant had meant a great deal to him. Daniel sat with the question. Had he communicated with the grant panel? He had reviewed grant applications in his field, as all senior academics did. It was a standard professional obligation. He did not remember the specific application. He reviewed many applications. He was direct in his assessments, always had been. It was a quality that made him useful as a reviewer and difficult as a colleague. He did not know, sitting in the engineer's booth of Symphony Hall, whether he had reviewed Owen Farrell's grant application and found it wanting. He might have. He might not have. The uncertainty was uncomfortable in the specific way that uncertainty about one's own past actions is always uncomfortable. Not guilt. Not yet, but the precursor to guilt, the recognition that the information required to determine guilt or its absence was no longer accessible. Ms. Lim, he said, I need you to send Detective Okafor that email, and I need you to be careful. If you have any reason to believe you're being watched or followed, or if anything seems wrong in your environment, acoustically or otherwise, I need you to call her immediately. A pause. You think I'm next? He did not answer the question directly. I think you were connected to the same professional network as the 2 people who have been killed. That makes caution appropriate. That's a yes, she said. Her voice was steady. He respected that. Detective Okafor will arrange protection, he said. In the meantime, do you have the email still? The one Farrell sent. I'll find it. They left her in the booth with 2 uniformed officers Okafor had arranged to remain outside Symphony Hall and walked back through the building service corridors to the exit on Huntington Avenue. The morning was cold, the kind of Boston October cold that arrives without negotiation, and the street noise hit Daniel in its familiar cascade. Traffic, footsteps, the specific acoustic texture of the city block adjusting to mid-morning. So, Okafor said, walking beside him. She had learned, he noted, to walk on his left side rather than his right, and to maintain a consistent pace rather than the variable one most people unconsciously adopted. Small adjustments. Useful ones. So he agreed. Farrell believes you destroyed his career. Apparently. Did you? He walked for a moment without answering. A taxi moved past, close enough that he felt the air displacement. A couple passed him speaking in rapid Portuguese, their voices receding quickly behind. The city doing its constant work. I don't know, he said. I review many applications. I am direct in my assessments. I may have reviewed his work and found it overreaching, as the panel ultimately did. Whether my assessment influenced theirs, I don't know that either. Okafor was quiet for a moment. How does that sit with you? He considered the question seriously. It was the kind of question he did not often get asked, partly because most people who worked with him kept the conversation professional, and partly because he was not known to welcome it. He found, unexpectedly, that he did not mind it from her. Uncomfortably, he said. She nodded. He heard the movement of it in the slight change of her breathing pattern. For what it's worth, even if you did, it doesn't justify. I know that, he said, but it explains the logic. He lost his hearing. He lost his career. He lost the ability to do the work he had built his identity around. And in his version of that story, the person responsible for professional destruction is me. He paused. That's a coherent narrative. I can follow it. Does following help? Yes, he said, because the next frequency in the sequence is 320 hertz, E above middle C, the third note that completes AC major triad. He stopped walking for a moment, orienting on the sound of traffic to locate the curb. And the next victim, if we don't find him first, will be the third person from that grant application. Patricia Lim is one possibility, but the sequence may not follow the list in order. Who else? He found the curb and stopped. Around him, the city moved in its morning patterns. Somewhere nearby a construction site was operating. A percussion section of metal and concrete, irregular and purposeful. The grant application had 4 collaborators, he said. Adler, Novak, Lim, and the person Farrell believed had undermined it. He paused. Me. The traffic light changed. He heard it in the shift of engine sounds, the cessation of movement to his left. The composition isn't finished, he said. A C major triad is 3 notes. We have 2. The third note, the one that resolved the chord, could be assigned to Lim, or it could be assigned to me. He stepped off the curb and crossed the street. Either way, he said, we need to find Owen Farrell before he plays it. Okafor crossed beside him, her footsteps matching his pace exactly. I've got every available resource on it, she said. I know, he said. It may not be enough. He's been planning this for years. He's had time to prepare things we haven't thought of yet. So have you, she said. Not the planning, but the thinking. You've been doing this longer than he has. He did not respond immediately. It was, he thought, a generous thing to say, possibly an accurate one. He was not accustomed to finding those 2 qualities in the same sentence from someone he had known for 3 days. Yes, he said finally, I have. They walked on to the Boston morning, the city loud around them, and Daniel listened to all of it. Every frequency, every layer of the acoustic environment, the way he always did, looking for the wrong note, the thing that didn't belong, the thing that would tell him where Owen Farrell was hiding in the silence he had made for himself. It was there. He was certain of it. He simply had not heard it yet. Chapter 7. Everywhere and Nowhere. Owen Farrell did not exist. This was a conclusion that Okafor's team reached after 4 days of searching through every database available to the Boston Police Department, the Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles, the Social Security Administration, the IRS, and 2 federal databases accessed through a contact at the FBI field office in Chelsea who owed Okafor a favor she declined to specify. No current address, no active bank accounts, no tax filings after 2017, no utility accounts, no lease agreements, no insurance records, no digital footprint of any kind that post-dated the year he had left Boston University on medical leave. It was not the absence of a man. It was a deliberate construction of one. He's not hiding, Daniel said, when Okafor briefed him on the 5th morning. He's been preparing. There's a difference. Hiding is reactive. What he's done is systematic. The methodical dismantling of a traceable identity over a period of years. That takes patience and planning. He knew, long before the first murder, that he would eventually need to be unfindable. They were in Okafor's office at Boston Police Headquarters on Tremont Street, a space that Daniel had mapped on his first visit and found, acoustically, to be the least interesting room he had been in all week. Drop ceiling, carpet tile, the particular deadening effect of a municipal building constructed in the 1980s with materials chosen for durability rather than acoustic quality. The sounds of the building moved through it flatly, without character. We found the Somerville P.O. box. Okafor said, abandoned. The Postal Service has been returning mail to sender for 3 years. We found a storage unit registered in his name in Medford, rented in 2016. Paid through a prepaid account that's been drawing from a single lump sum deposit. No renewal activity needed until 2027. The storage unit. We got a warrant this morning. My team went in 2 hours ago. She paused, and in the pause Daniel heard something that was not quite hesitation, but its close acoustic neighbor. You should know what was in it. He waited. Equipment, acoustic measurement tools, professional grade, the kind an acoustic engineer would use for site surveys, portable absorption panels, consistent with what you theorize was used in the South End parking structure. Chemical supplies. The lab is running them now, but the preliminary assessment is consistent with the compounds used in both murders. Another pause. And files. Printed, not digital. 3 folders. Tell me about the files. The first 2 contain research, academic papers, annotated. A lot of it is yours, your published work, going back to your dissertation. Some of it is Adler's. Some is Novak's. The annotations are, she chose the word carefully, extensive. And the third folder? A silence that was 1 beat longer than the others. Photographs. Surveillance photographs. You, primarily. Your office building. Your walking route home. The lecture hall. The anechoic chamber in Building 36. Her voice was steady, but he heard the effort in the steadiness. They go back at least 18 months. Possibly longer. The drop-ceiling office held its flat, characterless quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang and was answered. Normal sounds. The sounds of a building doing its daily work, indifferent to the specific quality of the information that had just been placed in the room. 18 months. For 18 months, Owen Farrell had been watching him, had walked the same streets, had stood outside the same buildings, had observed the patterns of a life that Daniel had believed. With the confidence of a man who processes the world through sound, he would have noticed being observed. He had not noticed. This was the most disturbing piece of information he had received since the investigation began. Not the threat of it, the professional failure of it. He heard things. He detected alterations in acoustic environments. He mapped the presence of people through the sounds they produced. And for 18 months, someone had been close enough to photograph him, and he had heard nothing out of place, which meant Farrell was not merely technically proficient. He was exceptional. He moved through acoustic environments the way water moves through a membrane, adapting to the space, producing no signature that did not belong to it. The storage unit gives us nothing on current location, he said. His voice was level. It was the voice he used when keeping it level required deliberate effort. No. He cleared out anything that could have given us a forward address. The equipment and files were left behind. Left or staged. A beat? What do you mean? He's been planning this for years. He knows we'll find the storage unit eventually. There's no version of a serious homicide investigation that doesn't trace the financial records and find a storage unit. What's in it tells us exactly what he wants us to know, that he has the means, that he has the knowledge, and that he has been watching me. Daniel stood and moved to the window. He could feel the exterior wall through glass, the cold differential of October air on the other side. He left it for us to find. It's another message. What's the message? I'm closer than you think. He turned from the window. And possibly, you're already too late. Okafor was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm doubling protection on Patricia Lim. Good. He reached for his cane. And I need the annotated files from the storage unit. All of them. Today. They're evidence. They're a communication, he said, and I'm the one it's addressed to. Have someone read me every annotation, every word he wrote in the margins of my work. I want to know how he reads me. He paused, because that's the only way to find him, not through databases, through his thinking. He left the office and walked through the building toward the exit, and the flat, dead acoustics of the place followed him all the way to the door, and then the city opened around him, and he breathed it in, all of it, every frequency, every layer, and wondered which of the sounds he was hearing right now was Owen Farrell, standing somewhere in the middle distance, watching him walk away. Marcus read him the annotations that evening. It took 3 hours. Farrell had annotated Daniel's work with precision that was, in a way that Daniel found difficult to name exactly, uncomfortably intimate, not hostile, not uniformly. Sections were marked with agreement, double underlines, occasional exclamation points, the marginalia of a reader genuinely engaged with the ideas on the page. Other sections were marked with a different kind of attention, systematic rebuttals, careful dismantlings, arguments that engaged with Daniel's methodology at the level of genuine technical understanding. And then there were the sections marked in red. These were fewer in number, but impossible to misread. They were passages in which Daniel had discussed the limitations of other researchers' work, not naming Farrell specifically, but describing methodological approaches that Farrell clearly recognized as references to his own. Beside one such passage, in Daniel's 2015 paper on acoustic reconstruction methodology, Farrell had written a single sentence in handwriting that Marcus described as pressed hard into the page. You told him this. Daniel sat with that sentence for a long time after Marcus read it. You told him this. Not, you wrote this. Not, you believe this. You told them. A specific act of communication directed at a specific audience with a specific consequence. A man who believed that a sentence in an academic paper was not a theoretical position but a weapon, deployed deliberately against him. The question of whether he was right, whether Daniel had, in fact, communicated his assessment of Farrell's work to the grant panel, remained unresolved. He had spent 2 evenings searching his email archives from that period with Marcus's help and had found nothing conclusive. A general review of grant applications in forensic acoustic analysis. A brief email to a colleague on the panel, noting that the field was producing some ambitious theoretical work that outpaced its methodological rigor. No names, no specific reference to Farrell's application. It might have been enough, in the small, lateral world of academic committees. A single sentence from the right person in the right register could shape an outcome without ever constituting an explicit recommendation. Daniel knew this. He had been in the field long enough to know how influence moved through it. Not loudly, but through the specific gravity of established reputation. He did not know if he had destroyed Owen Farrell's career. He knew, with increasing certainty, that Owen Farrell believed he had. And he knew, sitting in his apartment that night, the city moving through its evening frequencies outside his window, a police cruiser parked on the street below whose engine he had mapped within 30 seconds of its arrival, that the distance between those two things was the most dangerous space he had ever occupied. Chapter 8. The Third Note. Patricia Lim died on a Thursday. She died despite the 2 officers stationed outside Symphony Hall, despite the additional officer inside the building, despite the protocol Okafor had put in place requiring Lim to check in by phone every 2 hours. Despite all of it, she died because Owen Farrell had been planning her death for considerably longer than Boston PD had been trying to prevent it, and because the gap between those 2 timelines was ultimately unbridgeable. She was found in the recording booth at the rear of the symphony's rehearsal space, a different room from the engineer's booth where Daniel had spoken with her, smaller, more isolated, accessible through a secondary entrance that existed for equipment delivery, and was not covered by the officer station inside the building, because no one had thought to ask about it, because no one had walked the building with the specific acoustic attention that would have identified every point of entry by the sound signature it produced when opened. Daniel did not say this when Okafor called him at 6:15 in the morning. He said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "I'm on my way." The scene at Symphony Hall had a different quality from Hartwell Hall. He registered this the moment he entered the building, not just the acoustic modification, which was present and consistent with the previous scenes, but something else. An atmosphere, if that word could be used without sentiment. A sense that the space had been used with greater urgency than before. Less time, more pressure. Or perhaps, he thought, more confidence. The recording booth was at the end of a corridor that smelled of cable insulation, in particular electrical scent of professional audio equipment that has been running continuously for years, a warm, faintly metallic smell that he associated with recording studios, with the technical infrastructure of serious musical production. He stood in the corridor before entering and listened. The acoustic modification here was different, not HVAC-based, as at Hartwell Hall, not portable panels, as in the South End. Something else, a quality of the silence that he needed another 30 seconds to identify. And when he did, the precision of it stopped him completely. The recording booth was already acoustically isolated. It was a professional recording environment, built to be sonically sealed from the outside world. Farrell had used the room's own existing properties, had chosen this location specifically because the silence was already built in. He had not needed to construct it. He had simply selected the right space. He was adapting, becoming more efficient. Daniel entered the booth. He did not need to be told where the tuning fork was. He could hear it. Or rather, he could hear its absence in the way the room's acoustic map registered the specific reflective signature of a small metal object placed on a human chest. He crouched beside it, held his hand above it without touching. 320 hertz. E above middle C. The third note, the note that completed the triad. He had predicted it. He had named the frequency 4 days ago in a phone call with Okafor, and he had been right. And Patricia Lim was dead anyway. And being right had been worth nothing at all. He stood and turned toward where he knew Okafor was standing, near the booth's door. Her breathing told him what her voice would have if she'd spoken. Controlled, but at the limit of its control. She had 2 officers outside this building when Lim died. She had done everything correctly within the information she had. It had not been enough. She checked in at midnight. Okafor said. Her voice was very flat. The flatness of someone who will not perform the motion they are experiencing, because performing it would be self-indulgent, and there is work to do. At 2, she didn't respond. We were inside the building by 2:10. He had 2 hours, Daniel said. From midnight. Yes. She let him in. It was not a question. The secondary entrance, equipment delivery, a door that required knowledge of the building's layout. Or he was already inside when your officers arrived, already in position. Okafor was quiet. He heard her processing it, the specific cognitive sound of a person reconstructing a sequence of events they wish had gone differently. He knew the building, Daniel said. The secondary entrance, the recording booth's existing acoustic isolation, the check-in schedule. He's been planning this specific location for some time, possibly since before we identified Lim as a potential target. He paused, which means he knew we would identify her. He planned around our investigation, not in spite of it. The silence between them had a weight that was not acoustic, but something heavier. The triad is complete, Daniel said. C, G, E. 3 victims. 3 notes. AC major chord. He moved to the booth's door. AC major chord is the most fundamental harmonic structure in Western music. It's the chord for which everything else is derived. In harmonic terms, it's a statement of arrival, a declaration of tonic. He stopped in the doorway, but it's also an opening, a key established. A piece of music that has announced what key it's in is a piece of music that has not yet begun. You're saying this isn't over. 3 people are dead and he hasn't reached me yet, Daniel said. No, it's not over. He walked out of the recording booth and into the corridor and let the smell of cable insulation and old equipment close behind him and thought about a C major chord. Its clarity, its openness, its quality of arrival that is simultaneously a quality of beginning, and understood that Owen Farrell had just finished his introduction. The composition was starting now. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The captain's name was Gerald Walsh, and he had been running the homicide division for 9 years with the specific competence of a man who had made his peace with the irreducible difficulty of his work and no longer wasted energy resenting it. Daniel had not met him before. He met him now, in a conference room at headquarters, for hours after leaving Symphony Hall. Walsh's voice was deep and carefully modulated, the voice of someone accustomed to rooms full of people who needed to be both informed and managed simultaneously. He spoke to Daniel with the particular directness of a man who had been briefed on his subject and had decided that treating him as anything other than what he was would be a waste of both their time. Daniel respected this immediately. 3 people dead, Walsh said. No current address on the suspect. No physical evidence at any scene that gives us a forward lead. And the suspect appears to have anticipated every protective measure we've put in place. He paused. Tell me something useful, Professor. The pattern of victims is complete, Daniel said. All 4 people connected to the grant application have now been targeted. 3 successfully. The 4th is me. Farrell will not add a 4th frequency, because the chord he's been building doesn't have a 4th note. He will come for me directly, which makes you both potential victim and our best asset, Walsh said. Not a question. The observation of someone working through a tactical reality he does not find comfortable but will not pretend is otherwise. Yes, Daniel said. Detective Okafor has recommended we move you to a secure location. I won't go. Walsh was quiet for a moment. He's killed 3 people, Professor. I know, and moving me to a secure location doesn't catch him. It removes the only variable in his plan that he cannot fully control, me. If I disappear from my normal environment, he waits. He's demonstrated the capacity for patience. He'll wait indefinitely. And when I return to my life eventually, he'll resume. Daniel kept his voice even, the technical register he used when emotion would compromise the argument. The only way to end this is to give him what he came for. Not the killing, the confrontation. He's been building toward a conversation. The murders are a preamble. He wants me to hear what he has to say. You want to use yourself as bait, Walsh said. I want to use myself as an audience, Daniel said, for a man who has been trying to get my attention for a very long time. The conference room was quiet. Walsh's breathing, steady considered, was the only sound for several seconds. Detective Okafor, Walsh said, Sir, if we do this, I want a protocol that keeps Professor Morrow alive. Non-negotiable. Understood. Then work it out. Walsh stood. The sound of a large man rising from a chair with the efficiency of someone who does not allow his body to become an obstacle. Professor, I hope you're as good as Okafor says you are. I'm better, Daniel said. It was not arrogance. It was, he believed, simply accurate. Walsh left the room. Okafor remained. In the quiet after the captain's departure, Daniel heard her let out a breath she had been holding for some time. You know he might not want a conversation, she said. He might just want to finish it. I know, Daniel said, but I don't think so. 3 murders that required months of preparation, architectural modifications, a specific harmonic sequence. All of that is not the work of a man who simply wants someone dead. It's the work of a man who wants to be heard. He paused. And I am, genuinely, the only person in Boston who can hear him the way he wants to be heard. Okafor was quiet for a long moment. That's either very reassuring or very frightening, she said finally. Probably both, Daniel said. Most true things are. Chapter 9. How He Reads Me. The annotations told a story that was not the story of a madman. Daniel had expected anger. He had expected the marginalia of obsession, the repeated grievance, the fixed idea, the distorted thinking of someone who had taken professional disappointment and fed it until it became something else entirely. He had worked 11 cases over 16 years, and he understood, at a clinical level, the literature on grievance-driven violence, the narrowing of the psychological world to a single injury, the repetitive loop of perceived injustice, the way ordinary cognitive processes warp under sustained resentment into something that resembles logic but isn't. What the annotations showed him, instead, was something more uncomfortable than that. Owen Farrell's engagement with Daniel's work was intelligent, more than intelligent. It was, in places, the most sophisticated critical reading of his methodology that Daniel had ever encountered. The rebuttals in the margins were technically precise. Several of the challenges Farrell raised, gaps in Daniel's acoustic reconstruction models, assumptions about material consistency that the empirical data did not fully support, were not wrong. He had never addressed them because no one had ever raised him in a form he was required to answer. In a different world, he thought, this would have been a productive professional disagreement. In this world, 3 people were dead. He was sitting in his office with Marcus across from him. The annotated file spread on the desk in a configuration Marcus had described in enough detail that Daniel could navigate its layout when a specific section of Farrell's annotations that he had been looking for finally arrived. It was in a paper Daniel had published in 2013, a theoretical discussion of what he called acoustic memory, the way physical spaces retain, in their material properties, the evidence of sound that have occurred within them. The paper had been one of his most cited. Beside the conclusion, a paragraph in which Daniel had written about the possibility of reconstructing not just the acoustic history of space, but the emotional register of events that had taken place within it. Farrell had written a full paragraph in the margin. Marcus read it aloud. The handwriting, Marcus reported, was smaller here than elsewhere, more controlled. The letters of someone taking care with what they were writing. Farrell had written, "This is what I tried to tell them, not just the physics, the meaning. Sound doesn't just carry information. It carries truth. And you understood that. You always understood it, which is why what you did is unforgivable. Not because you believed my work was insufficient, but because you understood it well enough to know it wasn't, and you said otherwise anyway. You protected your position. You took the idea, and you buried the man who had it first. I want you to know that I know. I want you to know that I can read you as well as you can read a room. I want you to understand what it sounds like when the truth has nowhere to go." Marcus finished reading. The office was very quiet. The last sentence sat in the air between them. "I want you to understand what it sounds like when the truth has nowhere to go." Daniel sat with it for a long time without speaking. The subtitle of the book he was writing with his own life. The subtitle of this entire composition. Not "The Truth Has a Sound," as he had been thinking of it, as a statement about his own methodology, his own relationship with acoustic evidence, but as an accusation, a charge, the claim of a man who believed that his truth, his specific, particular intellectual contribution, had been silenced by the one person with the standing to have amplified it. Daniel, Marcus said, his voice had the quality it adopted when he was about to say something he had been holding back. "Do you think he's right?" Daniel did not answer immediately. He turned the question over with the same deliberateness he gave to acoustic data, not rushing processing, not imposing a conclusion before the information had settled into its natural shape. The honest answer was, he did not know. He did not know whether he had reviewed Farrell's grant application. He did not know whether a sentence in a general email had shaped the committee's decision. He did not know whether Owen Farrell's theoretical framework, which he had read once in 2011 and found overreaching, had in fact contained something he had failed to recognize, or had chosen not to recognize, because recognizing it would have required acknowledging a peer in a field he had, for the entirety of his career, occupied with the quiet certainty of the only person doing what he did. He did not know, and not knowing, in a case in which 3 people were dead and the 4th target was himself, was the most disorienting experience he could recall having in a professional context. He operated on certainty. He built things from certainty. The absence of it felt in a way he could not acoustically map, like standing in a room whose dimensions he could not determine. "I don't know," he said. Marcus absorbed this. "That's the first time I've heard you say that. Is it in 11 years? "Yes." Daniel said nothing. Outside the window, the Charles River was doing what it did. Its low, wide frequency moving through the afternoon, indifferent to the specific nature of the things being thought above it. "It doesn't change anything operationally," he said finally. "Whatever the truth of what happened 13 years ago, 3 people are dead. Farrell will come for me. We need to be ready when he does." "I know," Marcus said. "I'm just—" He stopped. "What?" "Worried about you." The words landed with the plainness of a person who does not use words carelessly and has chosen these deliberately, not because of Farrell, because of a pause, the other thing. Daniel considered this. Marcus had worked for him for 11 years. He had organized his professional life with a precision and loyalty that Daniel had never explicitly acknowledged and had never needed to, because acknowledgement of that kind was not the language of their working relationship. The working relationship was the acknowledgement. But Marcus was worried about him, not about whether Owen Farrell would find a way past the police protection and into his building, about whether the margin note in a 13-year-old paper was true. Daniel found, unexpectedly, that he was grateful for the distinction. "Thank you," he said. It was not a phrase he used frequently. He was aware of this. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. Daniel picked up his phone and called Okafor. She answered on the first ring, as she always did. "I've read the annotations," he said. "I know what he wants, and I know where he'll choose to do it." A brief silence on her end. "Tell me." "He'll choose a space that's already acoustically meaningful, not a space he has to modify. He's past that now, past the stage of demonstrating technical capability. He wants a space that means something to both of us, a space that is, in acoustic terms, the most significant environment in my professional life." He could hear her processing. "The anechoic chamber, Building 36, MIT, the quietest room in New England." He paused. "A room that is, by design, the complete absence of everything he has lost." The line was quiet. "When?" she said. "Soon," he said. "He's finished the introduction. The composition starts now." He stood from his desk and moved to the window. The river sound finding him through the glass. "We need to be inside that building before he is. And we need to be very, very quiet." He ended the call and stood at the window and listened to the city and thought about a man who had lost his hearing and spent years building a masterwork in the language of the thing he could no longer experience, who had walked the same streets as Daniel for 18 months, invisible, patient, exceptional, who was... Daniel understood now with the full weight of the recognition. Perhaps the only person alive who understood sound the way he did, who was coming, who was already, in some sense he could not yet acoustically locate, here. Chapter 10. The Trap. The plan, as Okafor laid it out the following morning, was simple enough to be credible and complicated enough to fail in several interesting ways. Daniel would return to his normal routine. Lectures, office hours, the 20-minute walk home each evening along the route he had maintained for 11 years. The police presence would be reduced to a single plainclothes officer, visible enough to satisfy department protocol, invisible enough not to alert Farrell, who had demonstrated capacity to read surveillance configuration and plan around it. The anechoic chamber in Building 36 would be monitored remotely, cameras installed at every approach, with a response team positioned in the building's service corridors. If he comes to the chamber, Okafor said, "We'll have him before he gets inside." If he comes to the chamber, Daniel said, "He'll know about the cameras." A pause. "You're saying he'll find another way in?" "I'm saying he's been inside that building for 18 months without being detected. He knows its acoustic geography better than anyone except me. Cameras at the approach points are a standard measure. He'll have planned for standard measures." Daniel set down his coffee, a habit Marcus had introduced years ago on the grounds that he needed to do something with his hands during meetings, and which he had adopted without comment. "The cameras are necessary, but they're not sufficient. We need something he can't plan for." "What can he plan for?" Daniel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Owen Farrell was methodical, patient, technically exceptional. He had anticipated the storage unit search. He had anticipated protection on Patricia Lim and had worked around it. He had spent 18 months studying Daniel's movements, his environment, his professional patterns. In every practical sense, he knew Daniel's world as well as Daniel did, except one. "He's deaf," Daniel said. "He lost his hearing progressively over 2 years, which means he can plan the acoustic environment of an encounter with precision. He knows the theory. He understands the physics. He can calculate what a space will sound like, but he cannot hear it in real time. He can't adapt to unexpected acoustic events because he can't perceive them." He paused. His preparation is his strength and his limitation simultaneously. He plans for every variable he can anticipate, but in a live acoustic environment, he's working from memory and theory. "I'm working from what's actually there." Okafor was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking. The particular quality of silence a person produces when they are genuinely recalibrating. So inside the chamber, his preparation means everything. He'll have mapped it, calculated every surface, accounted for every acoustic property. Outside the chamber, in the building, in the corridors, there are variables, sounds he can't account for in advance, things that change. Daniel stood. We need to make the building unpredictable. How? I'll tell you what to change and where. Small things. The kind of acoustic alterations that only matter if you're navigating by sound. He moved toward the door of the conference room. He's been studying my environment for 18 months. It's time I started changing it. Okafor followed him into the corridor. You're going to turn his own method against him. I'm going to make his map wrong, Daniel said. In a building he can't hear in real time, a wrong map is everything. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The modifications took 2 days. Daniel walked every corridor of Building 36 with a facilities engineer named Kowalski, who had the commendable quality of following instructions without requiring explanations for them. They moved furniture. They changed the position of a heavy equipment cart in the basement corridor that had sat in the same location, according to Kowalski, for at least 3 years. They added a rubber mat at the base of the stairwell on the second floor that altered the acoustic signature of footsteps on the landing. They adjusted the door tension on the third-floor fire door so that it closed 2 seconds faster than it had before, changing the sound it made when it swung shut. Small things. The kind of things that would not register visually. The kind of things that only mattered if your map of the building was built from sound. Daniel walked the building afterward and listened to what he had made. It was different, not dramatically. To anyone without a specific relationship to acoustic information, it was the same building. But to someone navigating it by the acoustic map they had built over 18 months of careful observation, it would be subtly, persistently wrong. The way a room feels wrong when someone has moved a single piece of furniture while you were away. The way the world feels wrong when the frequency you rely on has shifted by a fraction of a tone. Disorienting, not disabling, but disorienting. In a situation where disorientation could matter, he reported back to Okafor that the building was ready. And now, she said. Now we wait, he said. He'll come when he's ready, not before. How long? I don't know. Days. Possibly a week. He paused. He's been patient for years. He won't rush the ending. Okafor accepted this without protest, which told him she had reached the same conclusion independently. He found, not for the first time, that working with someone who reached correct conclusions without requiring them to be explained was a more unusual experience than it should have been. He went back to his office. He taught his classes. He walked home each evening along his usual route. He listened to everything. He waited. Chapter 11. Night Frequency. On the 6th night, Daniel heard something wrong on his walk home. It was not dramatic. It was not the sound of footsteps behind him, or a voice, or any of the things that announced themselves as significant. It was subtler than that, a quality of the acoustic environment on the stretch of Memorial Drive between the MIT Boathouse and the Longfellow Bridge that was different from what it should have been at 11:15 on a Tuesday evening in late October. He stopped walking. The river was to his left. He could hear it. The low, wide frequency of moving water. The particular way the Charles ran at this time of year, colder and faster than in summer, the surface texture of it changed by the temperature drop. To his right, the road. Behind him, the acoustic signature of his own footsteps still settling into silence, the way sound lingers briefly in physical space after its source stops. Ahead, the bridge, its steel structure producing the faint harmonic resonance that large metal constructions generate in cold air. All of this was correct. What was not correct was a silence in a specific band of frequency, the mid-range acoustic information that should have been present from the area of the riverbank 30 meters to his left. There was a bench there, a stand of trees, an area of open ground between the path and the river's edge that at this time of night, in this weather, should have been producing a specific texture of ambient sound. Wind through bare branches, the particular acoustic return of an open space, the small movements of water at the bank. It was too quiet, not silent, Silence would have been obvious, alarming, a gap. This was quieter than it should have been by a fraction that most people would not have noticed. A fraction that Daniel noticed because he had walked this route for 11 years, and the acoustic map of it was as detailed and reliable as anything he possessed. Someone was there, standing still, managing their acoustic presence with extraordinary skill, controlling their breathing, their movement, the friction of their clothing against itself, but absorbing the ambient sound of the space around them in the way that a human body always does, regardless of how still it stands. A body in a space is an acoustic event. It cannot be otherwise. Daniel did not change his pace. He did not reach for his phone. He walked forward at the same speed he had been maintaining, his cane finding the path ahead with its usual rhythm, and he counted his steps and calculated the geometry of the space and thought about what to do. The plainclothes officer assigned his protection was 30 meters behind him. He knew this from the specific acoustic signature of her footsteps, Officer Chun, who had been following him for 6 days and had learned to maintain a consistent distance, but whose shoes on pavement produced a sound he had cataloged on the first evening and could locate precisely. She was close enough to respond. She was not close enough to respond quickly. He walked past the point on the path that was closest to the bench. Nothing happened. The too quiet zone passed on his left, and the normal ambient sound of the riverside returned, and he walked another 50 meters before he allowed himself to process what he had just experienced. Farrell had been there. He was certain of it. Not to act. Not tonight. Not on an open path with a protection officer 30 meters back. But to watch. To confirm that the routines he had observed for 18 months were still in place. To verify his information before he moved. He was close. He was checking his map. Daniel reached the end of Memorial Drive and turned toward his building and took out his phone and called Okafor. He was on the riverbank tonight, he said when she answered. Memorial Drive near the boathouse, 30 meters from my path. Chen didn't report. Chen didn't hear him. I did. He kept walking. He's verifying his plan, running a final check on variables before he moves, which means it's soon. Tomorrow or the night after. A silence on her end. Then, I'm pulling Chun off the street detail and putting her inside Building 36 tonight. Good. Daniel. Her voice had shifted registers slightly, not losing its professional control, but a control doing different work than usual. If he was that close tonight, and you were the only one who detected him, then tomorrow night, you need to not be alone at any point. Not for any reason. I understand. Do you? Because understanding it and actually... Sarah. It was the first time he had used her given name. He was aware of this as he said it, aware that it marked something, that it was a different kind of address than he had used with her before. I understand. I'll call you before I leave the building tomorrow. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to tell him that the use of her name had registered. Okay, she said. He ended the call and stood outside his building and listened to the street around him. The familiar night sound of Cambridge, the particular acoustic character of his neighborhood at this hour, and found every frequency in its expected place. Farrell was gone, but he had been here. And that fact changed the acoustic map of everything. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. He did not sleep well. This was not fear, or not primarily fear. It was a heightened state of a system running at full capacity. The specific wakefulness of someone whose primary instrument of perception has been put on alert and cannot easily stand down. He lay in the dark of his apartment, which was not dark to him in any meaningful sense, simply the nighttime acoustic environment of his home, familiar and mapped to the millimeter, and he thought about Owen Farrell. Not tactically. He had done the tactical thinking. He thought about him as a person, which was something he did rarely in his professional life and found, when he did it, consistently uncomfortable. A man who had built a life around sound and lost it, who had developed a theoretical framework for using acoustic analysis to find truth, and had then watched, or believed he had watched, the one person with the standing to validate that framework use it instead to bury him, who had spent 7 years in a silence that was not the clean, engineered silence of the anechoic chamber, but the irreversible silence of progressive deafness. The world going quiet by degrees, the instrument failing, the language disappearing word by word, and who had responded to that silence by constructing, with meticulous patience, a message in the only language he trusted, not words, not arguments, sound, or rather the absence of it, the deliberate architectural silence that was his version of a voice. Daniel understood, lie in the dark, that whatever Owen Farrell had become, whatever he had done, the thing at the root of it was recognizable, the need to be heard, the specific, intolerable experience of having something true to say and no mechanism for saying it. He had spent his entire career building mechanisms for exactly that, for extracting the truth that sound carried, for making audible what had been silenced. The bitter irony of being the person against whom that need had turned was not lost on him. He did not know if he had destroyed Owen Farrell's career. He knew that tomorrow or the night after, he would have the opportunity to ask. He lay still and listened to his apartment. The refrigerator's low hum, the building's heating system, the faint sound of a neighbor's television 2 floors below, and waited for morning. Chapter 12. Building 36. Farrell came on the second night. Daniel was in his office when it happened, staying late, as he had announced to Marcus and to the department administrator, and to anyone who might reasonably pass the information to the ordinary channels of institutional life. Working on a paper that did not in fact require him to be there past 7 in the evening, but which provided a credible reason for the lights in his 4th-floor office to be visible from the street until 10. At 9:47, the building changed, not dramatically, not the way buildings change in the acoustic imagination of people who have not spent years learning to read them. No doors slamming, no footsteps in the corridor, no sounds that announce themselves. What changed was the baseline, the low, continuous acoustic texture of the building at night, the sum of its systems and its materials and the sound that moved through it from the city outside. Something entered that texture and altered it the way a stone alters the surface of water. Not loudly, but perceptibly, the disturbance spreading outward from a point. Someone had entered the building through the basement service entrance. Daniel knew this because the service entrance produced a specific acoustic signature when it opened, a combination of the door's weight, its seal, the pressure differential between the basement and the exterior, and because the signature had just reached him, faintly, through the building's structural materials, not through the air, through the walls, the kind of transmission that required a very quiet building and a very attentive listener. He reached for his phone and sent a single prearranged text to Okafor, B36. Now! Then he put the phone face down on his desk, stood, and picked up his cane. He did not call out. He did not lock his office door. He walked to the door, opened it, and stood in the corridor and listened. The building's modified acoustic environment was immediately apparent to him. The furniture moved, the mat at the stairwell, the adjusted door tension. He had recalibrated his own map to account for the changes. Farrell had not. Below him, in the basement, he could track the movement of a person navigating by a map that was no longer accurate. Small hesitations, fractional pauses, the acoustic signature of someone adjusting their expectations against what they were finding. The equipment cart that had stood in the east corridor for 3 years was no longer there. He heard the moment Farrell reached the place where it should have been and found empty space. 1 second of stillness, then a recalculation, then movement again, slower. Good. He was working harder than he had planned to. Daniel moved to the stairwell and descended. He did not use the elevator. The elevator was loud, announced itself, removed the acoustic information he needed. He took the stairs with the careful, silent efficiency of a man who had been navigating unfamiliar spaces in the dark for 42 years, his cane barely touching the wall for orientation, his footsteps placed with a precision that produced almost no sound. He reached the basement level and stopped. Farrell was in the east corridor, 20 meters, perhaps 25, moving toward the anechoic chamber with the deliberateness of someone who knows where they are going but is no longer entirely certain of the path. The rubber mat at the stairwell landing had confused him. Daniel could hear in the slight irregularity of his movement pattern, the fractional misalignment between where Farrell's feet expected the floor to be and where it was. Daniel followed. He kept 15 meters between them and matched his pace to Farrell's, absorbing the sound of his own movement into the building's baseline the way he had learned to do over years of moving through spaces where being heard had consequences. This was the advantage that no amount of planning could replicate. He did not need to see. He did not need light or cameras or the visual information that constituted normal human navigation. He needed only what was already there, the acoustic environment of a building he knew completely, moving through it behind a man whose map was wrong. Farrell reached the anechoic chamber door. Daniel stopped 10 meters back and listened to the sound of the door being opened, the specific sequence of the handle, the seal releasing, the pressure change as the chamber's engineered interior met the building's corridor. Farrell had a key, or a copy of one, which told Daniel something about the depth of his preparation that he filed carefully for later. Farrell entered the chamber. The door did not close behind him. An invitation, or a provocation, or simply the act of a man who had planned this moment for years and wanted to be certain it arrived as planned. Daniel stood in the corridor for 10 seconds. He heard nothing from the chamber. Of course he didn't. That was the point of it. The anechoic chamber absorbed everything. Whatever was happening inside, it was happening in a silence so complete that it was acoustically another world. He checked the time on his phone by touch. Okafor's team would be in the building in 4 minutes. He had been told not to enter the chamber alone. He had agreed to this at the time with the genuine intention of honoring the agreement. He stood in the corridor with the open door of the chamber 10 meters ahead of him and the silence pouring out of it like something physical, and he thought about 3 dead people and an annotation in a margin and the sentence "you told them this," and he thought about a man who had lost his hearing and spent 7 years building this moment. He thought about all of it for 4 seconds. Then he walked to the door and stepped inside. The silence of the anechoic chamber closed around him like a hand, and for the first time in his professional life, Daniel Morrow could not hear anything at all, which meant he understood immediately that neither could Owen Farrell. In the most silent room in New England, they were equal. "I wondered," said a voice from the darkness, "if you'd come in." The voice was rougher than Daniel had expected. The voice of someone who had not used it regularly for a long time. The particular quality of speech that atrophies without the feedback of hearing itself. But it was controlled, deliberate. The voice of someone who had rehearsed this. "You left the door open," Daniel said. "Yes," Farrell said. "I did." The chamber held their voices without echo, without reverberation, without the acoustic memory that every other space in the world retains. Words said here vanished the moment they were spoken, absorbed into the fiberglass wedges, leaving nothing behind. It was, Daniel thought, the most honest environment he had ever been in. "Then say what you came to say," he said. "I'm listening." In the perfect silence, he heard Owen Farrell breathe, and then, at last, he began to speak. Chapter 13. The Conversation. Owen Farrell's voice in the anechoic chamber was the voice of a man reciting something he had written and rewritten many times, alone, in the silence of a life that had narrowed to a single purpose. He said, "I want you to understand what I lost." Daniel said nothing. He had positioned himself 3 meters inside the chamber door, which he had left open behind him. He could not hear Okafor's team in the building. The chamber absorbed everything, but he knew they were there or would be within minutes, and he knew that Farrell, who could not hear them either, would be operating on his prepared plan and not on real-time information. This was the asymmetry, small but real. "I lost it in stages," Farrell said. His position in the chamber was to Daniel's left, perhaps 4 meters. Standing, his voice carried the particular flatness of someone speaking in a space without reverberation for first time. The shock of hearing your own voice die the moment it leaves your mouth, with no return, no echo, no confirmation that the sound has existed at all. First, the high frequencies, the detail, the way you hear the difference between a violin and a viola when they play the same note. That information lives above 8 kilohertz, and I lost it first. Then the mid-range. Conversation became an effort. I could hear that people were speaking, but not always what they were saying. And then the low frequencies began to go, and I understood that would all go. When did you know it was permanent? Daniel asked, not as a tactical move, as a genuine question. A pause. Perhaps Farrell had not expected to be asked. 2015. The audiologist used the word irreversible, and I drove home and sat in my car in the parking garage at BU for 2 hours. I didn't go inside. I just sat there and listened to the sound of the garage, cars, echoes, the HVAC system, because I understood for the first time that I was memorizing them, that I was going to lose them. Daniel stood in the engineered silence and let this arrive without deflecting it. It arrived with weight. I know what that is, he said. The memorizing. I do it with every space I enter, building the map before it can be taken away. You do it by choice, Farrell said. The flatness in his voice sharpened slightly. I did it because I was losing the ability to do it at all. Yes. Daniel did not argue the distinction. It was a real one. The grant application. Tell me what you believe happened. The quality of Farrell's silence changed. More charged. The silence of a man who has been waiting a long time for an invitation to speak. I submitted a framework that was original, he said. The panel's feedback used the word overreaching. I know that word. It's the word people use when they want to dismiss something without engaging with it. 2 weeks after the rejection, I received an email from a colleague on the panel, a friend, someone who owed me honesty. He told me that the panel had received a communication from a senior figure in the field characterizing the theoretical framework as insufficiently rigorous. He didn't name the source. He didn't need to. There was only one person in Boston with the standing to move that committee with a single email. You assumed it was me. I knew it was you. Daniel absorbed this. You may be right, he said. A silence, longer than the others. What? I don't know with certainty whether I reviewed your application. I review many applications. I am direct in my assessments, and I do not always consider the full consequences of directness at a distance. He kept his voice even. This was the most difficult sentence he had spoken in a professional context in 16 years. I may have characterized your framework as overreaching in a communication that reached the panel. I genuinely do not know. I have searched my records and found nothing conclusive. But the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and I am not prepared to tell you it didn't happen. The chamber was so quiet that Daniel could hear his own heartbeat. He focused on it, the steady, reliable percussion of a body doing its work, and waited. You're telling me you don't know, Farrell said finally. His voice had changed again. Something in it. That was not what Daniel had expected. Not rage. Something more complicated, and in some ways harder to hear. 7 years. 3 people dead. And you don't know. No, Daniel said. I don't know. I'm sorry. The last 2 words were not a formula. They were not the professional courtesy of an apology offered to manage a situation. They were what they were. In the silence of the chamber, where nothing could be disguised by the ambient noise of the world, he believed Farrell heard them as such. What happened next happened fast. Farrell moved. Daniel heard it. The displacement of air that a body in motion produces, even in a space designed to absorb sound, the fractional change in the acoustic pressure of the chamber that his auditory system processed in a fraction of a second before his conscious mind caught up with it. He stepped left and back simultaneously, and the thing Farrell swung, something solid, a length of metal pipe or a heavy torch. He could not determine which, passed through the space where his head had been and connected with nothing. The floor of the anechoic chamber was irregular. The fiberglass wedges extended across it, requiring careful navigation even for someone who could see. Daniel had walked it many times. Farrell had not, or not recently, and his map of it was the map of a man who had stood in the doorway and calculated rather than move through it in the dark. Daniel moved toward the door, not running. Running in the chamber would be as dangerous for him as for Farrell. The irregular floor trap for anyone moving without full attention. Fast, careful steps, his cane finding the path. Farrell came after him. He was faster than Daniel had expected. The body of someone who had spent 7 years of solitary preparation, physical as well as intellectual, but he was navigating by sight in total darkness, which meant he was navigating by nothing, and the floor of the chamber was not forgiving of imprecision. Daniel heard him stumble on the second row of floor wedges. Not fall. He caught himself, the sound of a hand finding a wall, a recovery, but it cost him 2 seconds. Daniel reached the door. He stepped through into the corridor, and the building's acoustic environment returned around him in a rush. The HVAC system, the structural sounds, the particular texture of Building 36 at night, and he oriented instantly, completely, the way a person orients when they step from a dark room into light. Here, he said loudly to the building, to wherever Okafor's team was. Corridor B, basement. He's in the chamber. From the far end of the corridor, he heard footsteps, multiple, fast, the heavy acoustic signature of officers moving at speed. And from inside the chamber, through the open door, he heard Owen Farrell stop moving. The silence from inside the chamber was different now from the engineered silence of its design. It was the silence of a man who understood that the thing he had been building toward for 7 years had just arrived at its end, and that the end was not the one he had constructed in his plan. Daniel stood in the corridor and listened to it, and found it, in ways he could not have explained to anyone who had not spent 42 years building their world from sound, one of the saddest things he had ever heard. Chapter 14. Aftermath. Owen Farrell did not resist arrest. He walked out of the anechoic chamber with his hands visible, moving carefully over the irregular floor with the precise, unhurried steps of a man who has accepted a situation and is managing his exit from it with whatever dignity remains available. Officer Chin cuffed him in the corridor. He said nothing. His face, which Daniel could not see but which Chin later described as calm in a way that was more unsettling than rage would have been, remained still throughout. Okafor arrived 40 seconds after the arrest, her footsteps in the corridor carrying the specific acoustic signature of someone moving fast who has chosen not to run. She stopped beside Daniel. "You went in," she said. "Yes. We had an agreement." "We did." He did not apologize. It would not have been honest. He left the door open. It was an invitation. If I hadn't gone in, he would have come out, and the encounter would have happened in a corridor where my advantages were less clear. A silence, the kind that meant she was deciding whether to accept the reasoning or argue with it. "Are you hurt?" "No." "He swung at you." "He missed." Another silence. Then quietly, "You heard it coming." "In the anechoic chamber." "Yes." "There's no ambient noise to mask movement. The displacement of air from a swinging object is detectable if your auditory system is calibrated for it." He paused. "It's the one place in the world where being blind and having my specific capabilities is an unambiguous tactical advantage. You plan for that." "I consider it a possibility." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied some of the same territory. It was the first time he had heard anything like it from her, and he found, unexpectedly, that he was glad to hear it. "The pipe," he said. "What was it?" "A Maglite, heavy duty, 8 D-cell batteries." A pause. "It would have been enough." "I know," he said. They stood in the corridor of the basement of Building 36, while Farrell was walked toward the stairs by Chun and a second officer, and Daniel listened to the sound of the building returning to itself, the HVAC, the structural settle, the distant sounds of the city above and outside. The same sounds as always, the building indifferent, as buildings are to what had happened within it. He thought about the conversation in the chamber, about the moment he had said, "I don't know," and "I'm sorry," and particular quality of Farrell's silence that had followed. He did not know what Farrell had heard in those words. He did not know if they had mattered. The movement that followed, the swing, the miss, the flight to the door, suggested that whatever Farrell had heard, it had not been enough to change the ending he had planned. Or perhaps it had been too much. Perhaps an apology, arriving 7 years late and hedged with uncertainty, was harder to receive than a denial would have been. A denial could be hated cleanly. This was something else. He did not know. He suspected he would think about it for a long time. "I need to give a statement," he said. "Yes, tonight, if you're up to it." "I'm up to it." He found his cane, which he had set against the corridor wall when the situation had required both hands, and picked it up. "Sarah." "Yes." "Thank you for the 4 minutes." She understood what he meant. He heard in the brief intake of breath that preceded her response. The 4 minutes between his text and the team's arrival. The 4 minutes in which everything had happened. "You're welcome," she said. "Although next time—" "There won't be a next time," he said. "No," she said. "I don't suppose there will." They walked toward the stairs together, and the building carried their footsteps upward through its structure, and the city waited above them, loud and indifferent and alive. *****. The statement took 2 hours. Daniel gave it with a precision he brought to everything: times, distances, acoustic observations. The sequence of events in the chamber rendered in the specific technical language of someone who experiences the world through sound and has spent 16 years translating that experience into forms that courts and investigators can use. Walsh sat in on the latter part of it. He said little. When Daniel finished, Walsh was quiet for a moment and then said, "For the record, Professor, you went into the chamber against the agreed protocol." "For the record, yes." "And it worked." "Yes." Walsh made a sound that was not quite approval, and not quite its opposite. "Off the record." He paused. "Good work." Daniel accepted this without comment. It was a correct response to a compliment he had earned and did not need to perform humility about. Marcus was waiting for him in a corridor outside the interview room, which was either excellent timing or the result of having been there for some time. Given what Daniel knew of Marcus, the latter was more probable. "You're all right," Marcus said. "Not a question." The statement of someone confirming a fact they had needed to confirm. "I'm all right." "Good." A pause. "I made a reservation at the Italian place on Hampshire Street for tomorrow, if you want." Daniel considered this. Marcus made reservations at the Italian place on Hampshire Street approximately 3 times a year, always at moments he judged to be appropriate occasions for something that functioned as a celebration without being called one. It was one of the more precise social calibrations Daniel had observed in 11 years of working with him. "Yes," he said, "that would be fine." Marcus said nothing further. They walked toward the exit together, and Daniel listened to the building around them. The night sounds of Boston Police Headquarters, the machinery of an institution processing the end of something, and found everything in its expected place. Chapter 15. What Remains? Owen Farrell was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, which his attorney filed within 72 hours of arraignment, and which the prosecution indicated they would contest vigorously. The trial date was set for the following spring. Daniel was not asked to testify at the arraignment. He would be asked, eventually, to testify at the trial. He accepted this as a fact about the future and set it aside. In the 2 weeks that followed the arrest, he returned to his routine: lectures, office hours, the walk home along Memorial Drive. The police protection was withdrawn after the first week. The acoustic modifications to Building 36 were reversed. The furniture returned to its position, the mat removed from the stairwell, the fire door adjusted back to its original tension. Kowalski did this with the same lack of curiosity with which he had made the original changes, which Daniel appreciated. He walked the building once after it was restored and listened to it return to itself. The same frequencies, the same acoustic geography he had mapped 11 years ago and maintained since. It was, he found, both comforting and slightly melancholy, the comfort of the familiar and the particular melancholy of a space in which something significant had happened that the space itself did not retain. Acoustic memory was his field, his conviction, the organizing principle of his professional life. But even he knew that it had limits. Some things happened and left no trace that could be reconstructed. The building had already forgotten. He had not. He thought about the conversation in the chamber with a frequency that surprised him. Not the physical part, the swing, the evasion, the exit. That sequence he had processed and filed with efficiency he brought to events that required action rather than analysis. It was the earlier part that returned to him. Farrell's voice describing the parking garage. The 2 hours sitting in the car, memorizing sounds. He had requested, through Okafor, access to Farrell's academic papers. All 11 of them. He had had Marcus read them in full, over 3 evenings, with the same attention he had given the annotated files from the storage unit. He had not told Marcus why, and Marcus had not asked. The work was good. He had known this in 2011, reading the first paper, and had chosen the word overreaching with the clean confidence of someone who had not considered that confidence itself was a form of imprecision. The theoretical framework was ambitious. It was also, he could see now with a distance of 13 years, and the particular clarity that comes from sitting in a silent room with the man who wrote it, not wrong, overextended, perhaps ahead of the empirical basis that would have supported it, but not wrong. He sat with his conclusion for a long time. He did not know what to do with it. Exactly. Farrell was in custody awaiting trial for 3 murders. The professional question, whether his framework had merit, whether Daniel's assessment had been unjust, whether a different response from the field might have produced a different life, was not a question that had actionable consequences in the present. 3 people were dead. Nothing he concluded about the academic record changed that, but he thought about it anyway. He was not accustomed to thinking about things he could not resolve, and he found the experience instructive in ways that were difficult to articulate even to himself. He was in his office on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after the arrest, when Okafor called. His attorney has filed a motion to include your academic history with Farrell's work in the competency evaluation, she said. They're building a narrative around professional relationship, or the perceived professional relationship. I expected that. The DA's office wants to talk to you, not as a witness, yet as background. I'll talk to them. A pause. Daniel. The question they're going to ask, did you have a professional relationship with Farrell? Did you communicate with the grant panel? Did your work influence his trajectory? I know what they're going to ask. And he was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, the Charles River was doing its November thing. Darker, faster, the surface of it carrying particular acoustic texture of cold water moving under a gray sky. He had listened to this river for 11 years from this window, and it had never, in all that time, told him anything he did not already know about himself. Today, it was less useful than usual. I'm going to tell them what I told Farrell, he said. I don't know. I may have influenced the committee's decision. I cannot confirm or deny it with certainty. I will testify to that under oath, and I will let the court do what courts do with uncertainty. A silence. The DA won't love that. No, but it's the truth. Yes, he said. It is. She was quiet for a moment longer than usual. He had learned, over the course of the past 3 weeks, to read the particular textures of her silences, the processing silence, the deciding silence, the silence that meant she was about to say something she had been considering for a while. This was the last kind. For what it's worth, she said, I think that's the right call. He did not respond immediately. He had not been seeking her assessment. He found, however, that he was glad to have it. Thank you, he said. Also, she said, and her voice shifted into the register she used for things that were not strictly professional, but that she was going to say anyway, that Italian place Marcus mentioned, on Hampshire Street. He waited. If the reservation's still open. He was quiet for a moment. I'll ask Marcus, he said. Good, she said, and ended the call. He sat for a while with the phone in his hand, and the river outside his window, and the building around him doing its reliable, familiar work. The acoustic environment of a life he had built carefully over many years from materials available to him. It sounded, today, slightly different from usual. Not wrong, not alarming, simply different, in the way that a space sounds different when something new has entered it and begun, quietly, to become part of the frequency. He picked up his phone and called Marcus. The reservation on Hampshire Street, he said. Make it for 3. Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then, of course. And Daniel could hear, in the 2 words, the specific quality of someone not smiling in a way that made it very clear that they were. He ended the call and turned back to the window and the river and the gray November light that he could not see, but that he knew, from the way it moved through the acoustic environment of the afternoon, was there. Some things he had learned you did not need to see to know were real. Epilogue. The faculty suite on the 4th floor Hartwell Hall was reopened to staff in December, after the crime scene designation was lifted and the building's facilities team had done what facilities teams do: cleaning, repainting, the quiet restoration of a space to its functional purpose, as though the deliberate erasure of what had happened were itself a kind of respect for the people who still had to work in it. Daniel went back on a Tuesday morning in early January, when the building was full again and the music department had returned from the winter break with a particular acoustic energy of a place resuming its purpose. He had not been asked to go. He had no professional reason to be there. He went because there was something unfinished in his relationship with the room, and he had learned, over the course of the autumn, that leaving things unfinished was a more expensive habit than he had previously accounted for. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The room sounded different from the last time he had been in it, not because it had been altered. The dimensions were the same, the materials the same, the arrangement of desks restored to its original configuration. It sounded different because it was inhabited again. 3 faculty members were present, working at their desks with the low acoustic signature of people engaged in individual concentration. A phone rang once and was answered quietly. Someone's chair moved through the closed windows. The Charles River was doing its January thing, darker and colder in October, its frequency lower and more deliberate. The acoustic modification that Farrell had installed in the HVAC return duct had been removed months ago. The building's transmission pathways were restored. The 4th floor was connected again to the acoustic life of the floors below and above it, to the practice room's bleeding scales through their heavy doors, to the stairwells carrying the sounds of people moving through a building with purpose. The dead zone was gone. The room sounded, in other words, like a room where people worked, where music was thought about and argued over and gradually understood, where the ordinary acoustic business of a life dedicated to sound was conducted without drama, day after day, semester after semester. Claire Novak's desk was occupied by someone new. He could tell from the different acoustic absorption pattern of the objects arranged on it. Different books, different materials, a different density of accumulated professional life. He did not know who sat there now and did not ask. It was not his business to know. He stood in the doorway long enough to hear the room completely, to build its current map and hold it alongside the map he had built in October, and to register the distance between the two. Then he turned and walked back to the elevator. In the lobby of Hartwell Hall, someone was playing the piano in one of the ground floor practice rooms, a student from the quality of it, working through a passage that required more patience than they currently possessed, stopping and restarting at the same difficult junction with the persistent, slightly frustrated energy of someone who knows the passage is within reach and has not yet found the way in. Daniel stopped and listened. The passage was in C major. Of course it was. It was a key that beginning pianists learned first, the key built on the white keys, the key that Western music had agreed centuries ago to call home. The student was playing a simple melodic line, nothing complex, nothing that would have troubled Claire Novak for a moment, but they were playing it with a specific quality of concentration that produces, in a listener, something that is not quite emotion and not quite its absence, the quality of someone doing a difficult thing and not giving up. C major, the chord that Farrell had built from 3 depths, 3 frequencies, 3 tuning forks placed on 3 chests with the care of someone making a statement they had waited years to make. Daniel had spent 4 months living inside that chord, its harmonic logic, its acoustic properties, its meaning in the grammar of Western music. He knew it in ways he had not known it before October. Listening to it now, in a practice room in Hartwell Hall on a January morning, played imperfectly by a student who would probably get it right by Thursday, it sounded like what it had always been before all of this, a beginning, not a statement of arrival, not an accusation, not a message addressed to anyone in particular, simply the first key, the place from which everything else departs and to which, eventually, everything returns. He stood in the lobby until the student found the passage, not perfectly, but well enough. The junction navigated, the line continuing past the point where it had stopped before, and then he walked out Hartwell Hall into the January air. The city received him with its usual indifference and its usual generosity, the full, layered, inexhaustible acoustic life of a place that did not know his name and did not need to, that simply continued producing the frequencies it had always produced, available to anyone with capacity to hear them. He had that capacity. He had always had it. He turned toward MIT and walked, his cane finding the familiar path, the city opening around him in all directions at once, loud and specific and alive. The truth, as always, had a sound. He listened. This was Blind Sight by Arthur Blackwood. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Your feedback and support help this channel grow. And if you know someone who would enjoy this story, please share it with them. Until next time.